Have you ever frozen your feet out there while on the water fishing? Ever had to quit fishing because your feet were so bad, so cold, they hurt so bad? You definitely don't want to worry about that while fishing, and today I'm going to share a few tips that I learned while out up in New York this year. We're going to get into it, and this is going to help you keep your feet warm and cozy this season. Hey, I'm Dave, host of the Wet Fly Swing podcast, and I've interviewed probably about as many fly anglers as anybody else out there. I've heard from the best, and I've been on the water with some of the best guides around the world, definitely around North America, some cold water, and I'm a winter steelheader, so I know a little about being in cold water. In fact, I was on a trip this winter just a couple weeks ago in New York, and the temperature was about 33 degrees. And so I've got a little story to share there. So today I'm going to give you the 5 biggest tips to keep your feet warm this winter and to avoid that frigid cold and to avoid you having to get out and miss a fish on your next trip. But let me tell you about that story before I get into these tips. So we just did this, just got back here a couple weeks ago. We were in New York. We started in Ohio and then worked our way up north. And as we were going up, you could just tell things were getting a little cooler. And then that night, it started snowing, and we had a couple inches of snow on the ground. Next morning, I think people were a little surprised. But what that did was kept the water cold, and the next day, as we looked at it, it was 33 degrees. And we're sitting out there in these runs, and it wasn't like we were wading up to our belt buckle, but, you're wading in, water up to your knees or whatever it was. And my feet started to get cold. And as I sat there, I just kind of kept going. And I hadn't hooked a fish yet. And eventually, I slowly tried to get out. I was trying to do some things to move around. But eventually, I had to get out of the water. And I just kind of sat in the bank and went down and talked to Rick. And it was because my feet were so cold. They were like feeling almost numb. They were painful. And I didn't have the right gear on, even though I know in the past I've done some things. I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. Some tips that came up recently on a podcast, one of our podcasts, and so I'm gonna talk about that and how you can avoid doing exactly what I did, which was miss an opportunity. In fact, that day I was skunked. I didn't get a steelhead that day, and I was fishing with Rick and our client there, and he actually got into a number of fish, mainly because he was out fishing, and one of the reasons why he kept fishing, he had one of these tips I'm going to talk about here today. So let's get into it. I'm going to share these 5 tips. This could be I think we got a bonus tip here too. So let's jump into it. So number 1, how to keep your feet warm. How to keep your feet warm this winter, and how to avoid missing fishing opportunities. One easy way. It costs a little money, but Bootfoot Waders. So Bootfoot Waders, and all transparency, I don't have Bootfoot Waders, but this is coming. This is a guide tip for sure. I've heard this many times, and I know this works, but Bootfoot are just more insulated. These are the waders the boots are attached to the waders. It's all the same thing, and they cost a little bit more, but they will keep your feet warmer than just your typical neoprene boots where you slip on your actual wading boots. So that's number 1, Bootfoot Waders. If you have the money, you want to do that. If you're going to be in cold water, definitely, I think I might actually do that for our next trip. Number 2, and this tip comes from Brian Niska. I hadn't heard about this little tip before. Brian now is hosting In the Bucket podcast, part of the Wet Fly Swing network here, and you're going to be hearing more about In the Bucket, an amazing new podcast with Brian. But in that podcast, he was talking to some of his guests, and he mentioned kind of getting oversized boots. So maybe go up a boot size or 2. And then wear a Bama boot underneath it. It's kind of like an insulated layer. And so you could do that underneath your waders. Just put it inside, like on top of your sock, and put that in. So that's one way. I've also heard that neoprene booties, an extra layer can work. But the Bama boot, I'm going to go with Brian on this one. Number three is the layering tip. And when you layer, try using get a nice merino wool, and then under that put a nice thin poly liner. This would be something. This came from some of the skiers / fishermen who were on the trip or who were on the last podcast with Brian, and they mentioned that, and that's a good tip. So layering if you want to keep your feet from getting cold, get a nice pair of merino wool socks, a nice thick pair, whatever you need, but then layer a poly layer of socks underneath that. That works. Again, a pro tip, and I've done lots of layering. Definitely layering is the way to go. And number 4 on the list is the tip that came on that day from our client who was out there, and he actually had actual heat warmers. So he had socks that were powered with a battery pack, and we were talking that day, and he fished all day long, and he actually caught a number of fish. I think he hooked over 5 fish that day, and he mentioned that his feet were not super hot, but it just cuts off the chill. So I don't have a recommendation on the exact brand, but I know there's plenty of those out there. If you want that from me, send me an email, and I'll reach out to him and get that and put that in the show notes. But think about that. That's another one. And the final bonus tip, actually, this isn't bonus. This is just a straight up tip. This is number 5. It's kind of like a bonus, but Brian Niska, again, back to Brian, in the Bucket podcast, he mentioned this is a super guide tip, but a hot thermos of water. He says that his guides will bring a hot thermos of water, and it gets really bad, and the clients are cold. They can pour the hot water on the boots of the fishermen, and that recharges the boots, gives them another shot to get out there. So there you go, hot water on the boots, and that's it. And I guess another more of a general bonus tip is just like we said, the more room, if your feet are super tight and scrunched, that's probably not going to be a good thing because it cuts off the circulation. So remember, you want to have some room. So if you have to loosen up the laces a little bit, that might be the thing to do, or even go up a size of boot bigger. There's a couple options. So why do we know these tips work? Well, they've come from the best of the best people, and they're in the cold water every day. So most of these, a good chunk of these came from Brian Niska and some of his snowboarding clients who were out there steelhead fishing and actually skiing. But from Brian directly, and so I know the guides who are in the water who are battling this every day, and I can just tell you the Skeena River is a cold river. Rick Kustich was out on our New York trip, and these guys are where I'm taking the knowledge and going for. All right, so final thoughts here. In my opinion, I mean, steelheading is, at least winter steelheading, you're going to be dealing with some cold water. And the colder the water, the colder your feet are likely going to get. So if you want to stay in the game and have a better chance, because it really is all about a numbers game, the more time you're on the water, the more good casts you make, the more casts you make, the more chance you have maybe to get potentially that one fish that day. And in my example, I missed an opportunity that day, probably because of this. So if you want to avoid that, keep your feet warm and keep your feet from freezing off, then and avoid the mistake I made, then this is one chance. Use these 5 tips and give it a go. If you want to check out some of the schools we talked about, Brian Niska is hosting our Skeena Space School, and Rick Kustich is hosting our Great Lakes New York School. These are 2 amazing guys at the top of the game. If you want to get a chance to check out upcoming trips, we're going to be going back to both of those places. Send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com. And I hope you enjoyed this short snippet episode. It looks like we're going to get this thing in around 10 minutes. I'm hopeful that I will be able to do a few more of these as we go this year, and I want to try to give a little more value, maybe get a break, and just mix things up a little bit. And I want you to have a better day on the water fishing this year. Appreciate the support, and definitely looking forward to hearing your best winter fishing story this year. We'll talk to you soon.